The sun's edge had just touched the eastern horizon. The 3 people in the hospital room on the 9th floor could have been among the first to witness it that day, but all their attention was focused on one another. Resting between his parents, the newest family member gazed up at them. As bright as the sun was on that beautiful spring morning, it couldn't compare to the warmth of the love they shared. In the doorway stood a young nurse, holding a blue blanket she had just pulled from the dryer. It had been delivered to the wrong floor, and they were running low on supplies. It hardly mattered in the grand scheme of things. She was exhausted, having helped with a dozen deliveries that night, and dealing with a constant stream of cranky doctors who had to juggle multiple births at once, covering for colleagues who couldn't be reached. Despite being new to the job, the nurse could tell this family needed their time together. She quietly walked over, placed the blanket on the corner of the bed, and exchanged a brief glance with the mother. She could see the exhaustion there, and she understood that the blanket, though freshly laundered, didn't matter at all. The birth had been touch and go. Late complications had caught everyone off guard, adding to the couple's fear. After years of trying to have children, their most cherished hope had almost slipped away at the final moment. It had been close, but now they were a family of 3, together. They would never forget those agonizing minutes during the night when it had seemed like they might lose their baby. The nurse smiled softly. Even though the night had been full of surprises, they were still dealing with one. They'd been expecting a girl. After the crisis had passed, the new father had clapped his hand to his forehead in mock frustration and said, "Oh no. I'll have to repaint the room again?" His tone was filled with happy bewilderment, which made everyone laugh, even the new mother, if only a little. The nurse had almost laughed again when the father, noticing the baby's hastily arranged outfit, asked, "You guys changed your minds again?" She was too tired, though, so she simply smiled. Edward Gordon, the newest member of the family, seemed just as pleased to meet them as they were to meet him. He lay there, listening intently to their loving words, and the sound of their hearts beating in unison. Rebecca, Thomas, and Edward Gordon were a small but very happy family. "He's beautiful," Rebecca, her old college friend Marjorie said softly. She had flown in overnight, arriving at 8 that morning. Even though it was nearly 9, her body still felt like it needed rest. Her thoughts were coming slowly. "Do you remember how Anna's first baby came out? We all called him the California Raisin, trying to find something nice to say to her?" Marjorie continued. "I'm not one of those people who thinks all children are beautiful no matter what, but he's just a doll." She smiled, genuinely happy for her friend. "I can't believe how much blonde hair he has at 2, Marjorie added. "I know," Rebecca giggled. "I'm going to have to cut it soon. Tom's getting tired of everyone thinking he's a girl," she laughed louder, "but I just love how adorable he looks. I can't bear to give him his first haircut yet. It feels like something I'll never get back." She paused, looking at her son. "I guess as long as I don't put ribbons in it again, Tom will let me keep it for a little longer." Marjorie chuckled. "God, Rebecca, you're still terrible. If I did something like that, David would freak." She paused to sip her coffee, watching little Edward play quietly in front of the TV, which he largely ignored in favor of talking to some stuffed animals. "Is he always so quiet?" Marjorie asked before realizing how her words might sound. She hadn't meant to imply anything strange about the child. "Not always," Rebecca replied. "Don't get me wrong, he has his moments. But he's one of the most affectionate little guys I know. When I put him down, he'll play quietly for hours, all by himself. Even when he needed a change, he'd crawl over to me, pull himself up, and never make a fuss. We're really lucky, Marge." "You sure are," Marjorie said, her eyes shifting back to the boy, a hint of envy mixed with admiration. "He's the most beautiful little thing I've ever seen. I'm so glad that even with David's constant job changes, I could finally come back to visit you, Rebecca." She hugged her friend, feeling the years apart melt away. "If your little angel stays put for a while, let's head into the kitchen. I'll make brunch for you." "Sound good? Someone else's cooking?" You don't have to twist my arm, Rebecca laughed, pulling her friend close. I'd do almost anything to eat someone else's cooking, except that Ronald clown's, of course. Laughing and chatting, they made their way to the kitchen. Zoe lived next door and was only 4 months older than Edward. Her mother and Rebecca were the same age, but Lily already had 3 children by the time Zoe was born. Like Edward, Zoe was Lily's last child, though hers had been a deliberate choice. Getting her tubes tied had been the only sensible decision for her, and she made it without hesitation. Lily was practical like that, loving, yes, but very grounded. It was only natural that the 2 children spent so much time together. What was surprising, though, was how well they played together. It was a godsend for both busy mothers, Lily, trying to restart her career while managing 4 kids, and Rebecca, juggling life with her young son. The children played so quietly and so well together, they often ended up babysitting each other for hours. Lily had told Rebecca that Edward was no trouble at all, and it was true. The 2 of them could sit for hours either playing or, on rare occasions, watching a Walt Disney movie without making a sound. Arguments over toys were unheard of. If one had something the other wanted, the child would simply watch, waiting for the toy to be passed over. Trustworthy and adorable as they were, Lily was still cautious about the 2. After finishing the laundry, she was heading upstairs to check on them when the clock struck 10 a.m. Reaching Zoe's room, she paused at the door. Surprisingly, the children weren't there. Unworried, she listened for a moment, and then heard the unmistakable sounds of them coming from her own room. Curious, Lily quietly opened the door and peeked in. There they were, hosting a tea party with Zoe's favorite dolls and stuffed bears. Lily stifled a giggle at how they were dressed. Both girls were in her clothes, large hats, scarves, jewelry, and all the finery expected at a high tea. "Would you care for sugar and cream in your tea, Mrs. Bear?" Zoe asked, her voice high-pitched and refined. She poured an imaginary cup for the bear, then turned to Edward, asking in the same voice, "And you, Charlotte? Would you like sugar and cream?" In his soft, gentle voice, Edward replied, "Yes, Zoe. Please." As he offered his cup to her, Lily noticed that they had also gotten into her makeup. Not wanting to startle them, Lily gently pushed open the door. "Oh, there you 2 are, having high tea with Mrs. Bear, I see," she said. She expected Edward to be embarrassed, but he simply smiled back at her, as did Zoe. "And who, may I ask, is this little lady, Zoe?" Lily asked brightly, as both girls giggled. "You know who this is, Mommy," Zoe replied. "This is Charlotte, my best friend in the whole world." Then, still in her falsetto voice, she added, "She and I have known each other for simply years." Lily giggled along with the girls, casually walking over to her dresser. She grabbed her digital camera and positioned herself across from the children. "That's very sweet," she said. "May I take a picture of your little tea party?" She heard both children agree and then squatted down, focusing the camera on their faces. Lily was suddenly struck by something she had seen nearly every day for the past 6 years, but had never truly noticed before. Edward looked every bit the pretty young girl, just like Zoe did. In fact, with his naturally beautiful features, he was simply stunning. Quickly, Lily snapped a few photos of the smiling children and slipped the camera to her side. "So, when did you 2 get so good with my makeup?" she asked, causing the 2 little ones to burst into giggles. "We found pictures in your magazines, Mom." Zoe laughed. "And we also had that book from the den that shows how. Remember you let me look at it, Mom?" Then, Zoe's voice shifted to a more serious tone. "You're not mad, are you?" she asked, glancing briefly at Edward before returning her gaze to Lily. Looking at her makeup table, Lily saw everything was more or less in order, and it was clear the children had only applied makeup to their faces. Remarkably, they had done so carefully enough not to make a mess, and had done a better job than she might have done at their age. It was still the work of children, but surprisingly skillful. "No, sweetheart, I'm not mad," Lily said, trying to sound as cheerful as she could. But you have to be careful not to get it all over Mommy's nice things, okay? She smiled. Now, be careful while you finish your tea, and Mommy will clean you two little ladies up before Charlotte's mother comes to collect her. Lily laughed again at the infectious giggle of the children. She would have called them scamps for getting into her things, but they were too dignified and beautiful for that. As she walked to the door, Lily took a few more pictures before slipping the camera into her pocket. Now, remember, she said with playful severity, you promised to let Mommy take off the makeup. Don't try to do it yourselves, okay? She waited for their response. Yes, ma'am, both children chorused. We wouldn't do anything naughty, like break a promise, ma'am, Edward said, his large blue eyes full of sweetness and sincerity. I know, sweetheart, Lily replied, smiling. I just wanted to make sure you don't get it in your eyes. You two look very pretty, and I'd hate to ruin a lovely tea party with a trip to the doctor. I'll call you when it's time to clean up. Okay, both children said in unison, turning back to their tea party as if they hadn't been interrupted. A few hours later, Lily sat at the computer, staring at the pictures. They looked more like an advertisement for a children's TV show than photos of two young children caught in the act. It didn't look like a boy and a girl, just two beautiful children. Lily sighed, then went upstairs to take Zoe out of the bath and tuck her in for the night, still distracted by the photos. All done, sweetie, she called toward the bathroom door. All done. Zoe squealed, flinging open the door, dashing past her mother in a towel, and jumping into her bed, landing on top of her clean pajamas. Oh, Zoe! Lily groaned, though a smile tugged at her lips as she looked at her youngest. After a 10-minute tickling session, her usual way of punishing Zoe's mischief, the child was slightly more breathless but happy, and Lily had managed to get her dressed and bundled into bed. Ready for sweet dreams, little one? Lily asked, looking at her beaming daughter. Yes, Mommy, Zoe answered gleefully. Did you remember to brush your teeth? Lily asked, checking in. Only about 100 times for every tooth, Mom. Front, back, sides, top, and bottom. I think I need a new toothbrush. Zoe replied. Lily giggled. Well, you just keep wearing that old toothbrush out, and I'll be happy to buy you a new one whenever you need it, okay? Okay, Mommy. Lily paused for a moment, then said, Listen, Zoe, I wanted to talk to you about something important. Is something wrong, Mommy? Zoe asked, her voice full of concern, though she wasn't really worried. No, baby. You were a very good girl today. I just wanted to talk to you about the tea party. Wasn't it great, Mommy? Zoe sighed happily. Charlotte and I had such a lovely time. And didn't Charlotte look just beautiful? Lily stared at her daughter, unsure how to steer the conversation in the direction she needed. Well, she sure did. Very beautiful, in fact. But I wanted to make sure you understand that you need to be careful and ask me before you do something like that again. Lily watched her daughter's reaction. Why, Mommy? Zoe asked. Well, aside from the possibility of ruining some of Mommy's nice things, you also could have gotten hurt. You're both too young to be using eye makeup. Trust me, if you get it in your eyes, you'll be sorry. It really stings. She told her daughter. I know, Zoe replied, but we were very careful. I can see that, baby, but it's more complicated than just being careful. You see, Edward is a boy, and while I don't mind you playing games here, some people might not like you both dressing up like that. Lily watched her daughter's eyes closely. I understand, Mom, Zoe said. We don't talk about the games Charlotte and I play with the other kids. We know they'd be mean to her. They're sometimes already. What? Lily gasped, but seeing the concern in her daughter's face, she quickly tried to compose herself. Sorry, sweetie. You've been keeping this a secret when you play like that with Edward? The thought of keeping secrets gave Lily a sinking feeling in her stomach, which she was trying hard to hide. Zoe, sensing her mother's unease, bit her lip, silently trying to figure out if she had done something wrong. After a few moments, she answered honestly, "Yes, we do. Sometimes the other kids call Edward names. Sisters? Sissy?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with concern. "That's it, Mom. Sissy. It makes Charlotte really sad, because he just wants to be friends. So we mostly play by ourselves and don't tell anyone," Zoe confided. "Well, Zoe, if the other kids tease you, why do you dress him up and put makeup on him?" "The other kids are one thing, but his mother might not like it either," Lily asked. "I didn't, Mom," Zoe replied softly. "What do you mean, baby? That wasn't you and Edward in my room this afternoon?" Lily asked, though she didn't believe for a second that Zoe was trying to deny it at this point. "I mean, I didn't dress him up. That was his idea," Zoe said simply. Lily paused for a moment to process that. "And what about the makeup, sweetie? Was it his idea for you to put it on him?" "Charlotte did that too, Mom. She put it on, and it looked so nice that I asked her to put it on me too," Zoe explained slowly. "Are you sure you're not mad?" The child seemed genuinely worried now, most likely because of the look on her mother's face. "No, dear, I'm really not mad. I just want to make sure you're being careful, that's all," Lily said, trying to smile. "Now, go to sleep. Tomorrow is Saturday, and we're going to the zoo, okay?" She gently ran her fingers through Zoe's bangs. "Yay!" Zoe sighed, her earlier concerns fading quickly. "I love visiting the animals." "I know, sweetie. Good night." Lily kissed her daughter on the lips, quickly and lightly. "Night, Mommy," Zoe mumbled, rolling over to sleep. From the door, Lily asked one more question. "Zoe?" "Yes, Mommy?" Zoe answered, her voice slow with sleep. "How long have you been calling him Charlotte?" Lily asked casually. "Just today?" "No, a long time, Mom. I always call her Charlotte when we're alone." Lily walked back downstairs, settling in front of the computer. "Is something wrong?" her husband asked. "No," Lily replied, "I'm just thinking. We're taking the kids to the zoo tomorrow." "Oh, goody," he responded, but without the same enthusiasm Zoe had shown. Lily snorted softly, but her mind was elsewhere. Suddenly, everything made sense, the time she'd caught Edward and Zoe trying on her Halloween princess costume, and the time she'd heard Zoe call him M during their quiet playtime. At first, she thought it was just a strange pet name, but now she realized it meant Charlotte. Most significantly, both children had clearly conspired, if not to hide it outright, then at least to keep it quiet. That made it feel very serious. Casually, she moved the cursor to select several items in a folder and clicked the printer icon. "Honey," she said, "I'm going over to talk with Rebecca for a few minutes. I'll be back in a little while, okay?" "Okay." "The car needs gas," he mumbled, not looking up from his paper. "It's just next door, honey," Lily whispered as she pecked the top of his head while passing by. "Okay, check the oil too then," he said absently. Recess was definitely the highlight of school, no debate about it. 10 out of 10 kids agreed. They had 2 breaks a day, one at 9:30 and another with lunch around 11:30. It was only a few days into the second week of school, and the kids were still getting used to their new routine of organized fun. Zoe and Edward were on the seesaw when they suddenly heard a scream coming from the direction of the monkey bars. Rushing to see what happened, they found themselves standing in a circle around one of the second graders, Luke, who was lying on the ground with blood staining the side of his face. Luke, just a year older than them, had been showing off, and it had gone wrong. Most of the other children just stood there, staring in shock at the blood on Luke's unmoving face, while a few had already run for the teacher. Only Edward moved toward him. Reaching into his pocket for a clean Kleenex his mother had insisted he carry at school, he pressed it gently against Luke's wound. Luke whimpered from the pressure. There, Luke, Edward said calmly, recognizing the larger boy from his neighborhood. You'll be okay. The teacher's coming. Edward slowly and carefully shifted Luke's arm out from under him, where it had been pinned awkwardly by his fall. Don't cry, Luke. Mrs. Adele is coming now. You'll be okay. Zoe, now at Edward's side, placed a hand on his shoulder as she watched him comfort the injured boy. Ow, my head, Luke groaned, fighting back tears as he slowly started to become more aware. You hit your head when you fell, Edward explained, adjusting so he could cradle Luke's head on his leg while keeping pressure on the wound. It doesn't look bad, he added, though he wasn't convinced. He bit his lip, knowing the lie wasn't quite right. Then, more softly, he asked, Is your arm okay? Yeah, I think so, Luke replied, lifting his hand and wiggling his fingers to check. I think you're supposed to stay still, so don't move, okay? Edward whispered. Luke closed his eyes slightly and gave a barely perceptible nod. What happened? Mrs. Adele, the headmistress, asked as she pushed her way through the crowd. He fell from the top, one of the kids said as Mrs. Adele knelt to assess the situation. Oh, God, Luke, she whispered, quickly checking Edward to make sure he wasn't hurt and to see if the blood she saw was from Luke alone. Don't move his head, dear, Mrs. Adele instructed, noticing one of the new girls cradling Luke's head in her lap. I'm not, ma'am, Edward responded. I'm keeping it still and pressing the wound. Good boy, Mrs. Adele said gratefully, glancing back to see the nurse and two other teachers rushing over. Help is coming, Luke, she reassured him. Luke nodded slightly, but as soon as he heard the adult voices, he began to cry softly again. Edward leaned in close and whispered, It's okay, Luke. It's not that bad. You'll be okay, I promise. Just lie still. The nurse is here. Just then, one of the older boys piped up. Would you look at that? Isn't that just precious? Little Edwina is gonna be a nurse someday. You'll make someone a fine mother, Edwina. He laughed cruelly. About half the kids chuckled along with him. Zoe, not knowing the older boy, shot him a glare that could have made a younger kid flinch. The older boy just laughed at her. That's enough out of you, Sims, Mrs. Adele snapped, her voice sharp and leaving no doubt that Sims had just earned himself another talking to. Recess is over for today, everyone back inside, she continued, her voice firm. The children groaned, though the bell was only a few minutes away, but they obeyed and began heading toward the doors, except for the three on the ground. Looking back, Mrs. Adele saw the two girls waiting expectantly. That's okay, dears. You can stay right there. But soon, Edward felt himself being lifted to his feet by one of the male teachers, while the nurse gently took Luke from his arms to begin treating him. Don't worry, dear, the nurse said to Edward. He'll be just fine. Edward smiled weakly at the nurse, though a few silent tears began to slide down his face. Zoe put her arm around his shoulders and gently began guiding him away. Come on, you two, Mrs. Adele said as she placed a hand on their shoulders to steer them toward another door. Let's get you two cleaned up. She spoke firmly, but kindly as they walked in the indicated direction. That was some quick thinking you did there, young lady, Mrs. Adele said to Edward. Did you see him fall? No, ma'am, Edward said softly. Zoe and I were on the seesaw when we heard him scream. We just ran to see, like everyone else. But then, Mrs. Adele continued, unlike everyone else who just stood there, you knew to administer basic first aid. I'm very impressed and very proud of both of you. She smiled warmly at them. So, where did you learn your first aid skills? In the brownies? Zoe answered for them. No, ma'am. We're not in Scouts. Zoe had lost interest in joining the brownies the day she found out Edward wasn't allowed. We saw it on a show on TV. Well, that was very clever of both of you, Mrs. Adele said, nodding. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows how well you handled this. She turned to Zoe. So, you're Zoe? She nodded at the girl, then looked at Edward. And your name, dear? Edward, ma'am, the boy replied. Edward Gordon. I beg your pardon? Mrs. Adele said, momentarily confused, before looking closer at Edward's clothes. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Gordon. I thought. She stopped herself, not wanting to embarrass the boy further. It's okay, ma'am, Edward said quietly. Everyone does that. The clock in the square had just struck 1, meaning they were later than they'd promised Zoe's mother. They were 15, having spent much of the morning in the village shops. Due home by 1, they were passing through the park on the way back to Zoe's house. Suddenly, from behind them, came the all too familiar taunts, but these ones were far more serious. Jesus, look at that now. Edwina's wearing pink lip gloss. Oh God, they'd forgotten. I'm so sorry, Zoe, Edward whispered. It's not your fault, Em, she said in despair. I forgot too. Just keep walking. Before long, they were surrounded by nearly a dozen neighborhood kids who began eyeing Edward with interest. That's mascara on his eyes, too, one of the girls remarked. You just leave her alone, Nora, Zoe said fiercely, stepping in front of her friend. It's okay, Zoe, Nora said, trying to show she meant no harm. I mean, so he's wearing makeup. And that's probably your white blouse, right? It's not that big of a deal. At that moment, the group's curiosity about a boy in makeup and blouses seemed to outweigh their desire to taunt him. One of the boys, James, spoke up. Ah, let them be. It's not like we've never seen the Gordon sisters before, is it? He looked at the others. Besides, most of you girls are probably just jealous anyway. I mean, James said, laughing as he reached up to brush Edward's long hair from his face. I think he's a lot prettier than most of you girls. So leave them be, and let's finish the game. Some of the kids began drifting away, losing interest, but Nora and 2 other girls stayed right in front of them, while another girl and 2 boys hung back a few paces. Well, why don't you 2 come back and hang with us for a while? Nora said cheerfully, her offer echoed by several of the other girls. It might have been okay, until Sims and his gang showed up. Well, bloody hell, Sims sneered, laughing and pointing at Edward. Zoe stepped in front of him again, but Edward gently held her back. No, Zoe, Edward whispered, fear in his voice as he knew things could get ugly. Run, Charlotte, Zoe whispered back. I can't outrun them, and it won't help, Edward sighed softly, just as Sims stepped right in front of him. Well, I was right. It's Edwina, and looking very pretty today, too, Sims said, his tone mocking. He was warming up to his taunts, but then he froze. When he spoke again, there was clear satisfaction in his voice. Well, he breathed, exaggeratedly. And the little fairy has finally done it. He's in drag, too. Well, isn't that just too sweet? He finished with a falsetto voice, putting both hands on his cheeks and feigning exaggerated surprise and glee to mock Edward. Well, Edwina? What are you doing? Cruising for a date for the pictures on Friday? His sarcastic remark caused a few of the kids watching from farther away to laugh. Leave him be, you bastard, Nora suddenly shouted, surprising everyone. What did you say, bitch? Sims snarled, his eyes dangerous. Nora tried to stand her ground, though she was clearly scared of Sims. I said leave him be. He's not bothering you. He's never done anything to anyone, she stammered. Shut your hole, girly, Sims growled. I'll let you know when I need your permission to take a piss. Right now, I think we should take little Missy here for a walk and see if it's really a girl or a boy under her knickers. Sims started advancing on Edward. This time, it was Zoe. You leave her alone, you sick pig. Her? Sims laughed. Well, we'll see about that, won't we? Maybe Edwina's about to have her first real date. Sims lunged to push Zoe aside, but Edward saw it coming. In a desperate attempt to protect her, he lunged forward to pull Zoe back, only to be cruelly knocked to the ground in her place. There was nothing he could do. Sims was much bigger and stronger. "Stop!" Zoe screamed, launching herself at Sims in a fit of panic. "Get off, bitch," Sims spat, swatting Zoe to the ground as well. She collapsed, sitting there in stunned silence, her eyes wide with horror. "Hey!" one of the other boys started to say, but was quickly tripped by one of Sims' cronies. "What's the matter?" Sims sneered sarcastically, enjoying the moment. "You afraid I might kill Edwina, and then you'd have to find a real girl to snog, you little dyke?" His words were laced with venom, and Zoe's face contorted in shock and rage. In the midst of her distress, Zoe heard someone shouting at the top of their lungs. "Her name is Charlotte, you prick. You don't even know her name, you moron." The echoes of the shout faded before Zoe realized who had screamed. Her heart sank, and she began to sob uncontrollably. "Oh, I'm so sorry. What do you think you're doing?" A calm voice came from her right. It was Luke. Even Sims froze. While Sims was older and meaner than the rest, Luke was bigger, by at least 20 kilos. "Nothing you need to worry about." Sims started, trying to bluff his way out, but his voice faltered as he saw Luke's calm approach. Without another word, Luke took 2 steps forward and, with no change in his expression, punched Sims in the face with a force so strong that both of Sims' feet left the ground. Sims and the unfortunate crony behind him fell to the ground with a sickening thud. The group was in shock. Luke had never hit anyone before, and it took a moment for anyone to process what had just happened. Sims wasn't out cold, but he lay on the ground, staring in stunned disbelief at Luke. Beside Luke, a girl was trying to wipe blood from her face. "That's it, Sims," Luke said quietly. "I told you before to leave them alone. You'd best find some other town to live in, because every time I see you from now on, I'm going to hit you just as hard. And if you ever touch one of my friends again, I swear I'll pull your head off. You've got 1 minute to get out of my sight, or I'll do it again right now." His tone was steady and calm, without a hint of aggression, but it left no room for doubt. Frantically, Sims' cronies began dragging him away. Edward quickly got up and rushed to Zoe, pulling her into a tight, protective hug. "It's okay, Zoe." "Shhhh," he whispered. "Oh, Charlotte, I thought." Zoe continued to sob. A few other girls gathered around them, trying to comfort Zoe, but it took a few minutes before she began to calm down enough for Edward to glance around at the circle of faces. Seeing Luke standing there, Edward gave him a weak smile of gratitude. "Thank you, Luke. If you hadn't come along." His words trailed off, unsure of what to say. "I should take Zoe home now," Edward said after a moment. "No," Zoe whimpered. "Take me to the table and let me sit down, please. I can't let my mum see me like this. She'll totally freak out." Reluctantly, Edward agreed, guiding Zoe to a nearby picnic table under a tree. Thankfully, one of the other girls soon appeared with a wet napkin, gently wiping Zoe's face. The girls worked together to help revive her a little. "I'm so sorry, Em. I forgot all about." Zoe began, her voice broken. "Zoe, it's me," Edward said softly. "Don't blame yourself for something I did. That animal was going to hurt you, Em. Really hurt you. If Luke hadn't come." Zoe trailed off, her face still clouded with concern. "I'm okay, though," Edward replied, trying to calm her. "Just try and breathe. It's okay." Luke, who had quietly been watching the scene unfold, spoke up. "I don't think he'll bother you again, Zoe." Zoe nodded silently, then pulled Edward into another tight embrace. "Oh, Charlotte, if anything ever happened to you, I don't think I could survive." It took her a little while to loosen her grip. "Sorry, everyone," she whispered. "I was just so scared for her." Nora, who had been silently observing, spoke up for the group. "We all understand, Zoe. We were scared for him too." She turned her attention to Edward, gently dabbing at his face with the wet napkin. "Here, Han, hold still. Your mascara's run a little," she said, carefully cleaning up the smudges under his eyes. "Good thing you didn't have too much on. You know, I think James was right. I'd kill for your eyes, and a little mascara does wonders for them." She smiled at him. "Thank you, Nora," Edward said softly as she let go of his chin. "But I'd better take Zoe home now." Just then, Edward stiffened as he felt a hand rest on his shoulder, holding him gently in place. "Hold on a minute." Luke paused to take a breath before asking the question that everyone had been thinking. "Charlotte?" Edward sighed, his shoulders visibly slumping. Zoe immediately went on the defensive, fearing the worst. "Luke, please don't tease him," she begged. "It's all my fault, really." Luke smiled reassuringly as he walked around to sit in front of the two, gently pulling Nora to sit beside him. "Zoe, you know I don't tease him, or anyone else," he said, his voice calm. "And you also know that no one teases him when I'm around. I just want to understand what this is all about, and why you call him Charlotte." Luke turned to Edward and gently asked, "Well, Charlotte?" Edward sighed deeply, his hands resting in his lap as he looked down. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I think you already know everything, Luke. I mean, it's not like I've tried or been able to hide what I am." For a moment, the group remained silent. Edward then leaned behind Zoe and reached into the small bag she had strapped to her back, pulling out a pink case filled with makeup and jewelry. Earlier that day, they'd stopped at the cosmetics shop to pick up some essentials, and it was the girl at the counter who had suggested a new lip color. Edward took out the tube and a compact, inspecting his face. Luke, his stomach burning with confusion and a growing sense of unease, finally found his voice. "What do you mean, what you are? Are you saying you're gay, Edward?" he asked cautiously, still not fully grasping what was happening. None of them had ever known anyone so different. Edward laughed nervously, shaking his head. He set the compact down and reached into his bag again, pulling out a brush and a white scrunchie he had packed earlier. As he carefully brushed his hair back, he explained, "No, Luke. It's not that simple." The others watched, captivated, as Edward quickly pulled his hair into a ponytail, securing it with the scrunchie high on his head. He then took out a white ribbon and tied it into a bow over the scrunchie before picking up the compact again. "I don't understand," Luke said, still confused. "Are you telling us you're not gay?" Edward took a deep breath, holding it for a moment before speaking again. "The truth is," he said quietly, "I'm not sure." He looked in the mirror again, adjusting the makeup on his face, before applying a little powder to his chin, cheeks, nose, and forehead. "I won't lie to you. I did have a crush on the boy who stayed in Stony Brook Cottage last summer, but I never did anything about it. Mostly, I'm attracted to girls. I just don't really know what gay means for me." As Edward continued, his hands moved with practiced ease, applying subtle eye makeup, lining his eyes with a liquid pencil on top and a regular pencil on the bottom. "So, you're bi?" Luke asked, still trying to understand. "Is that why she calls you Charlotte?" Edward looked at Luke, his expression sad. "She calls me Charlotte because that's my name, Luke." Luke was trying hard to comprehend, but his brows were furrowed in confusion, as were the faces of the others. "I'm a girl, Luke," Edward said simply, and began to apply mascara to his lashes. The admission seemed to startle Zoe a little. It was the first time Edward had said it out loud. At first, Luke had been ready to snap at Edward, thinking he was just making fun of them. But as he watched the transformation before him, he couldn't help but be mesmerized, as were the others. When Edward finished adding some rose color to his cheeks and put on a finishing coat of bright pink lipstick, he stood up. He pulled the white top out of his waistband, blousing it around his midriff, revealing that his jeans were clearly girls' jeans. He reached into the bag once more, pulling out a delicate silver filigree belt with a floral pattern, which he fastened around his waist. Then, he retrieved a necklace with a heart pendant and small earrings, putting them on with ease. Finally, he slipped off his trainers and put on low-heeled shoes, taking a step back and nervously facing the group. Standing there, hands clasped together in front of him, he tried to maintain eye contact, though his nerves were palpable. "Oh my God," Nora gasped, her hands moving to cover her mouth. "You look fabulous." "Thank you, Nora," Edward said shyly, a blush spreading across his face. "Bloody brilliant," Jimmy, who had moved from England the year before, exclaimed. Everyone agreed he looked beautiful, and though it embarrassed Edward, Zoe beamed as she reached out to squeeze his hand. "I can't believe how you do that so easily," Luke said softly, still staring in awe at his longtime friend. "I mean, you've always been good-looking, but now you look like any of the girls." "I told you, Luke," Charlotte said quietly, looking at them all. "I'm a girl. I always have been. I think something got messed up when I was born, but inside, I've always felt like this." She raised her hands in helplessness. The worst part was, not only was she incredibly pretty, a real knockout, but every movement now seemed so feminine, so natural, even the way she shrugged. "Why didn't you tell us?" Nora asked, her voice soft. "Are you kidding?" Zoe snapped. "With everyone shouting Sissy all the time and worse? Did you think he wanted a target painted on his back?" "I can see that," Nora replied, nodding. "What should we call you now, then?" Luke asked gently, causing Charlotte to blush deeply. "Charlotte, if you don't mind, Luke," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my name. It's what I call myself." She looked down for a moment before continuing, her voice tinged with sadness. "I never meant to lie or play a mean trick on anyone. I just didn't want to freak everyone out. But I can't keep pretending not to be who I am anymore. I'm sorry, but it's getting harder with each passing day." She looked down again, her hands trembling slightly. "Well," James spoke up suddenly, "I don't know about anyone else, but I'm freaked out. I mean, really, Ed. I mean, Charlotte. There you are, looking hot. I'd say I'm pretty thoroughly freaked out." But when Charlotte looked at him, his expression held more compassion than horror. "But I don't mind calling you Charlotte. If that's what you say your name is, then it's good enough for me. I've always thought you were the nicest kid in school, so what if you're now the prettiest too?" The others were quiet for a moment, but several of the girls exchanged looks. Charlotte turned to Luke, seeing the deep concern in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Luke. All the times you've stuck up for me, when the other kids were picking on me, calling me those awful names. I just feel like I've stabbed you in the back. I guess they were right all along, even with those horrible names." The pain in her eyes was evident, the tears welling up. "Don't be silly, Charlotte," Luke said gently. "Nothing you did ever caused that. I still wouldn't stand by and let anyone pick on you. You've always been good to me, too. I never understood how you could just take it, without getting mad, but now I guess I do. It'll take some getting used to, but not much. You do make a very pretty girl, Charlotte. The real question is, what are you going to do now?" "I don't know, but I'm going to take Zoe home now," Charlotte said, standing and pulling Zoe up beside her as she started putting her things back in her bag. "Her mom's really cool about it. I suppose if I never see you again, it's because my mom either killed me or sent me to a home, but I think I need to have a long talk with her right now. So, for what it's worth, thank you." The others brushed off her thanks, and several of the girls stood up to hug both Zoe and Charlotte, wishing them good luck. To Charlotte's surprise, Luke stepped forward, too. "You call me if you need me, Em," he whispered seriously. "Thank you all for being so kind, and trying to understand," Charlotte said sincerely, her voice full of gratitude. You're the ones who are brilliant, she added, echoing one of Jimmy's favorite expressions. I'm really sorry for causing so much trouble. Taking Zoe's hand, she began to walk toward home, feeling both relieved and nervous. She knew it was time to face her mother before the word got around, but what she had said was painfully true. She couldn't pretend anymore. When you had to censor everything you thought or said, when you had to watch every movement and word, it just wore you down. She was too tired to keep it up, no matter what the consequences might be. Mother, I'm sorry, but you've got it all wrong, Charlotte said, pausing as she turned off the alarm clock by her bed. She had set it for 2 p.m. to remind her that she needed to be ready by 2:30 to get to the movies on time. I've got it wrong? Rebecca said, her voice frantic. Look at yourself. I've tried to understand, you know I have. We've spent money on doctors, even though your father thinks you've just charmed them like you do with everyone. And you're still doing stupid things, like going out dressed like that. Do you think Simmons is the only one out there? For the love of God, think about what you're doing before you get hurt. Charlotte calmly continued getting ready, checking her makeup and outfit for the 10th time, while doing her best to pay attention to her mother's fears and frustrations until they had run their course. May I talk now, Mother? Charlotte asked calmly, sitting on the bed beside Rebecca, who had seated herself with a look of disgust. Of course, sweetheart, Rebecca said, though her voice still held anxiety. I never said I wouldn't listen. I just don't want you, or anyone else, to get hurt. Mom, listen. I've been going out like this for a long time now, Charlotte said gently. What you don't understand is that when I dress like this, I'm actually safer than when I dress the way you want me to. She placed her fingers softly on her mother's lips to stop her from interrupting. The truth is, when I'm dressed like this, people treat me kindly, and I really like that, Mom. Rebecca just stared, taken aback by the revelation. You see, Charlotte continued, when I dressed as a boy, that's when I got into the most trouble. I looked so strange trying to act like a boy, and people could see it. That's when I was targeted, not now. I know some people are still narrow-minded and dangerous, but you raised me to be careful, and I always am. Today, I'm going to the matinee with Zoe, Nora, Luke, James, and Jimmy. I promise you, no one is going to bother me with the boys there. Rebecca had long since realized that Luke had become Charlotte's protector. She knew he was bigger than her husband, which gave her some comfort, but still, leaving it to a young, polite boy felt like a mistake. She struggled to reconcile her image of him with the punch the girls had described to her months ago. Listen to me, she thought, suddenly frustrated by her own confusion. The girls. Indeed. Her mind raced, and she shook her head. Edward, you are one of the boys, and if anyone finds out. Not where it really counts, Mom, Charlotte said, placing her hand on her chest. In here. We have different ideas of where it counts, dear, and so will the rest of the world, Rebecca snorted. I know that, Mom, Charlotte replied. But you know, in the end, that might be the easiest part to change if I decide to go that way. For now, it's the part that gets covered by my new clothes. She finished with an infectious smile. So, what do you think? She asked, gesturing to her outfit. Rebecca let out a small laugh, despite herself, taking in the complete look, Charlotte's pretty skirt and top. Charlotte, she thought, is a little small and thin, but she is very beautiful. Rebecca stopped herself, realizing she was losing this argument. You look lovely, honey. That was never the problem. Or maybe it was. She trailed off, giving up. So you like my outfit? Charlotte beamed. I had to babysit for weeks to get the money for it. Is it okay?